My son didn't save me a seat at his college graduation. His stepfather walked across the stage with him to accept a special family recognition award. And when the dean said, "To the man who made all of this possible," 400 people stood and applauded. Then someone in the third row turned around, pointed at me standing alone against the back wall, and said loud enough for half the auditorium to hear, "Isn't that the biological father? The one who abandoned them?" I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. I drove to Hartfield University that morning the same way I'd driven to every important moment in my son's life for the past 18 years. Alone, uninvited in any real sense, and about 30 seconds from turning around. The invitation had come through his mother, a single text forwarded from her phone to mine, the kind of message that technically fulfills an obligation without actually extending one. Ceremony starts at 10. Parking is $15 at Lot C. No, we'd love to have you there. No, your son wants you here. Just logistics, the bare minimum required so nobody could later say I hadn't been told. Connor was graduating with a degree in civil engineering from one of the best programs in the state. He'd been accepted on early decision 3 years ago, and I'd found out from his aunt, my sister-in-law from my first marriage, the one person who still fed me information about my own son's life, like I was a spy operating behind enemy lines in my own family. I stood against the back wall because every row was full by the time I arrived, and because honestly, I wasn't sure where else I was supposed to stand. The parents section was up front, reserved seating with little printed name cards, and my name wasn't on any of them. I'd checked when I first walked in, running my finger down the cards on each chair like a man looking for his name on a guest list at a party he wasn't supposed to be at. Connor Sullivan, Barbara Sullivan, and one more, Gordon Hale, her husband of 15 years, the man who'd moved into the house I used to pay the mortgage on about 8 months after our divorce was finalized. Gordon was a good-looking man in the way that men who've never really struggled tend to be. Easy confidence, well-fitted blazer, the kind of salt and pepper hair that looks distinguished rather than just old. He had his arm around Barbara when they walked in, and Connor was next to him laughing at something Gordon said, relaxed in a way I hadn't seen my son be around me in years. I watched them from the back. That's what I'd gotten good at over the years. Watching from the back. The ceremony itself was beautiful in the way these things always are. Too long, too warm inside the auditorium, too many names read aloud in careful alphabetical order. When Connor's name was called, I clapped harder than anyone around me, though nobody near me knew why. He walked across that stage with his chin up and a grin that reminded me so sharply of him at 7 years old. The same grin he used to give me when he'd built something out of Legos that actually worked, that my chest physically hurt. Then came the family recognition portion. I hadn't known about it. Barbara hadn't mentioned it in her text, which I later understood was not an accident. The dean called Gordon's name specifically. Gordon Hale, it turned out, had made a significant contribution to the university's new engineering lab. I'd find out later exactly how significant, and Connor stood at the podium with him while the dean talked about the family that invested not just financially but emotionally in Connor's journey. Gordon put his hand on Connor's shoulder. Connor said, "This guy right here is the reason I'm standing on this stage. He believed in me when nobody else did." I don't know if he forgot I existed in that moment, or if he simply meant what he said the way he understood it to be true. Either way, it landed the same. The man behind me, the one who pointed me out, said it again to his wife after the applause died down. "That's the real father. I heard he just disappeared on them." His wife made a sympathetic sound. A woman 2 seats over turned to look at me with the particular expression people reserve for stray animals in cautionary tales. I waited until the recessional had started before I left. I didn't want Connor to see me walking out. That felt like the one dignity I could still offer him, not making his graduation about my feelings. I sat in Lot C for 45 minutes before I could drive. It took me almost 3 days to understand the full scope of what I was sitting inside. I wasn't looking for it. I wasn't trying to unravel anything. I was just doing what I'd been doing for 2 decades, which was running a business and trying not to think too hard about everything I'd lost. I own a company called Bridgeway Structural Consulting. We started small, just me and two engineers working out of a converted garage in 2001, and grew steadily into something I'm genuinely proud of. We consult on commercial and civil construction projects across the Midwest: bridges, overpasses, public infrastructure, the occasional large private development. We're not flashy, but we're good. And over time, good compounded into something larger than I'd planned for. About 4 years ago, we were approached about a significant contract with Hartfield University for the design consultation on their new STEM complex, a $40 million construction project that included, among other things, a state-of-the-art engineering laboratory. I hadn't thought twice about it. Universities are exactly the kind of long-cycle infrastructure clients we work well with. We submitted the proposal, won the contract, and my lead engineer handled most of the day-to-day relationship with the university's facilities team. I never once connected it to Connor. He was enrolled in the engineering program, yes, but the university has over 12,000 students. The idea that the lab being built with our consultation was the same lab that would bear Gordon Hale's name, the same lab my son would spend 3 years learning inside, didn't occur to me until I opened my project files on a Tuesday morning 3 days after the graduation and saw the formal acknowledgement document my team had received from the university's development office, the Hale Family Engineering Laboratory at Hartfield University, dedicated in honor of Gordon and Barbara Hale's commitment to the next generation of engineers. Gordon's significant contribution to the lab, the donation that had earned him a nameplate on the door and a standing ovation at my son's graduation, was $75,000. Our firm's consultation work on the same building had been billed at just under $340,000, a figure that didn't include the 2 years of back-and-forth design revisions my senior engineer had done largely pro bono. Once the project went over scope, Gordon had bought naming rights to a room that I'd essentially helped design and build. I called my project manager, a woman named Tess who'd been with me for 11 years, and asked her to pull the complete file. She had it on my desk within the hour. I sat there and went through every document, every email chain, every invoice. The university's facilities director, a careful, thorough man named Dr. Abrams, who I'd met twice in person, had sent our team a thank you note at the completion of the project. It was still in the file, printed on university letterhead. Bridgeway's work on this project has created a facility that will serve Hartfield's engineering students for generations. Generations. Connor was in the first graduating class to have used that lab all 4 years. I kept reading. The more I looked, the more I found. Hartfield's main parking structure, the one where I'd paid $15 to stand against a back wall, had been built by a general contractor who used our geotechnical reports as the foundational basis for the entire design. The pedestrian bridge connecting the north and south campuses, the one Connor and every other student walked across every single day, had been a Bridgeway project in 2018. Even the dormitory where Connor had lived his freshman year had gone through a structural review process that our firm had been contracted to complete after a foundation concern was flagged during renovation. My son had spent 4 years walking across bridges I'd engineered, studying in a lab I'd designed, sleeping in a building I'd certified as safe. And the man who got the standing ovation at his graduation had written a check that was roughly 20 cents on every dollar I'd put into that campus. I'm not saying Gordon didn't love my son. I genuinely believe he did. I'm not saying Barbara was wrong to build a life after our divorce. She had every right. What I'm saying is that the story being told about who had made all of this possible, that story had a very significant chapter missing from it. Let me tell you how we got here. Because it didn't start at the graduation. It started the night Barbara told me she wanted a divorce, sitting at our kitchen table in the house on Clover Ridge Road. Connor asleep upstairs, the baby monitor on the counter still crackling with the small sounds of a 6-year-old breathing. I was 34 years old. I was working long hours, that part was true. I had started Bridgeway 2 years earlier with borrowed money and the kind of optimism that either turns into a company or a cautionary tale. And at that point, it was still unclear which direction it would go. Barbara and I had been together since college. She was the kind of woman who wanted stability the way other people want adventure. It was her core need, non-negotiable, and I was, by her accounting, providing the opposite. What she didn't tell me that night was that she'd already been spending time with Gordon. He'd been her client at the insurance brokerage where she worked, a successful commercial real estate developer who drove a new truck and owned his house outright and had never once, as far as I could tell, experienced a single moment of financial uncertainty in his adult life. He was exactly the kind of steady that I wasn't yet. The divorce was civil by the legal definition of that word, which means it was devastating in all the ways that don't show up in paperwork. We split custody, technically. Wednesdays and every other weekend were mine, but Barbara moved 40 minutes away within the year, into a house in Gordon's neighborhood, and 40 minutes is a long way when you're 6 years old and your mother is telling you, in the gentle, persistent way that loving mothers can, that your dad is going through a hard time, and it might be easier for you to stay home this weekend. I fought it. I want to be clear about that. I hired a family law attorney. I filed motions. I showed up to every mediation session, every court date, every custody review. And every single time, I was the man who worked too much, who had started a risky business, who lived in an apartment while Gordon had a 4-bedroom colonial with a yard. The legal system looks at stability, and stable was the one thing I hadn't yet become by the time Bridgeway was genuinely successful, and it took about 5 years to get there. Connor had already decided that Gordon was his dad, not officially, not legally, but in the way that matters, which is the way a child organizes the world in his own mind. Gordon coached his Little League team. Gordon helped him with a science fair project. Gordon drove him to his first high school visit. I was the man Connor visited on alternating weekends and called by my first name, a habit that had started somewhere around age 9 and that neither Barbara nor Gordon had ever corrected. I sent birthday cards every year. Connor acknowledged them with one-line texts by the time he was a teenager. Thanks, or cool, or occasionally nothing at all. I came to his middle school graduation and sat in the back. I came to his high school graduation and sat in the back. I came to his high school graduation and sat in the back. I paid my child support without fail. And then some. Because I knew what it felt like to worry about money, and I never wanted Connor to feel that, even if he didn't know where the stability was coming from. When he got into Hartfield, Barbara emailed me, not to share the news. Connor hadn't called me, but to ask about the FAFSA contribution they expected from me as a non-custodial parent. I sent what they asked for, plus a separate check for Connor directly, a graduation to college gift that I wrote a note to go along with. He sent me a text that said, "Thanks for the money." That was the last direct communication I had with my son for almost 2 years. I thought about driving up to see him at school. I thought about it a lot, actually. I'd look up the campus on my phone sometimes late at night, the way you look at something you're not sure you're allowed to want. But every time I started to reach out, I imagined the conversation, him politely telling me it wasn't a great time, Barbara finding out and interpreting it as interference, Gordon maybe getting involved, and I'd put my phone down and go back to work. That's what I knew how to do: work, build things, make something out of difficult ground. Tess knocked on my office door on a Thursday afternoon about 2 weeks after the graduation. She had a look on her face I recognized from the years we'd worked together. The one that meant she'd found something she thought I needed to know and wasn't sure how to say it. "The Hartfield project files," she started. "I went back through everything like you asked, and I noticed something." She set a summary sheet on my desk. Connor Sullivan is listed in the lab dedication program as a student whose academic path was shaped by this facility. They do this profile piece every year for the donors. She paused. He's quoted in it. He talks about wanting to build infrastructure that lasts, bridges, specifically. Bridges. My son wanted to build bridges, and he'd spent 4 years learning how in a building I'd helped design, and he had no idea. I didn't know whether to laugh or put my head down on my desk. What I did, eventually, was write him a letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual letter. The kind you write by hand and seal in an envelope. I wrote 3 drafts. The first one was too much, too raw, too much of 20 years of accumulated hurt spilling onto the page. The second one was too careful, too distant, too much like a business memo. The third one was just true. I told him that I had watched him graduate from the back of the auditorium and that I was proud of him in a way I couldn't fully put into words. I told him that I hadn't been the father he deserved when he was young, not because I didn't want to be, but because I had failed at the thing that mattered most at that time, which was being present. I told him I'd spent a long time building something I wished I'd had earlier, and I told him that if he ever wanted to know me, not the version he'd been given, but the actual person, I was here. I didn't mention the consulting contracts. I didn't mention the lab, I just told him the truth about who I was and what I'd gotten wrong and what I wished had been different. I didn't expect him to respond. I mailed it and I went back to work, and I tried not to sit by the phone. He called 6 weeks later. I almost didn't answer. It was a number I didn't recognize. He'd gotten a new phone at some point, and I let it ring twice before something told me to pick up. "Dad?" His voice was careful, the way voices are when they're testing a word they're not sure they're still allowed to use. "It's Connor." I sat down. "Hey," I said. "Hey, I'm really glad you called." There was a pause on his end. Then, "I got your letter. I've read it probably 4 times. Another pause. "I didn't know you were at my graduation. I was in the back. I didn't want to make it about me. Mom never told me you'd be there." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Can I ask you something? Anything? The Bridgeway name, I've seen it on signage around campus, mostly the engineering buildings. Is that your company?" I exhaled slowly. "Yeah, that's mine." The silence that followed had a different quality to it. Not empty, full actually, full of something being recalculated. "The lab," he said finally. "The one we used all 4 years. We did the structural consultation on it, yes. In the pedestrian bridge, the one between North and South Campus, 2018, that was one of ours." I heard him breathe. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because it wasn't about that," I said. "I didn't take those contracts because of you. I took them because they were good projects. And then when I put it together, after the graduation, I figured telling you would have looked like I was trying to score points. That's not what I wanted." "What did you want?" "I wanted you to know your father, the actual one, not the version your mom needed you to believe in when you were 6. That opened something." He didn't yell. Connor was never a kid who yelled, but he asked questions for 45 minutes straight, the kind of questions that tell you a person has been holding them for years. Why did I stop fighting for custody after a certain point? What have the early years of the business really been like? Did I have regrets? I answered all of them honestly, including the hard ones. He asked about the custody fight, and I told him the truth, that I had fought, that I had the documents to prove it, and that at a certain point the system had made it clear that stability on paper mattered more than effort in person, and I had been slow to build the kind of stability that showed up on paper. I told him that wasn't Barbara's fault entirely, and it wasn't Gordon's fault, and it wasn't his fault, and it was mostly mine. Not because I hadn't cared, but because I hadn't understood fast enough that caring wasn't the same as showing up in the specific ways the world required. "I thought you just gave up," he said. "I know you did. I think your mom thought that was easier for you." Another long pause. Was it? I don't know. Was it? He took a while with that one. "No," he said finally. "It wasn't easier. I just thought I wasn't supposed to miss you." I had to put the phone down for a second. Just for a second. We talked for 2 more hours that first call. About his job offer. He'd already been recruited by a civil engineering firm in Chicago. About his girlfriend, a woman named Lee who he'd been with for 2 years and who sounded, from the way he talked about her, like exactly the kind of person you hope your kid ends up with. He asked about my work, and I walked him through a few of our current projects. And somewhere in the middle of explaining a drainage infrastructure project in rural Ohio, I heard something in his voice shift. Genuine interest, the professional kind, the kind that sounds like a person recognizing a conversation they want to have more of. "You know," he said, "one of my professors always said the best structural work is the stuff nobody notices unless it fails." Your professor was right. That sounds like something you would have said. I didn't know what to do with that. So I just said, "Yeah, I think it probably does." 3 weeks after that first call, he drove down to meet me for lunch. He brought Lee, which I took as a good sign. You don't introduce a parent to someone you're serious about, unless you're thinking long-term about both relationships. We met at a diner halfway between my office and his apartment, a place with good pie and the kind of lighting that hides whatever complicated feelings might be working across your face. He looked like me. That was the first thing I thought when he walked through the door. I hadn't been close enough to see it clearly in years, but standing in that diner doorway, the way he held his shoulders, the way he scanned the room before he moved, it was undeniable. He looked like me, and nobody had ever told him that. Or if they had, He hadn't been allowed to sit with it. We talked for 3 hours. Lee was warm and sharp and had clearly already heard enough about me to come prepared with her own opinions, which I respected. Connor ate his entire plate of food and half my fries. Some things you just know about your kid even when you've been away too long. I didn't bring up Barbara until he did. He brought her up about 2 hours in, carefully, the way you approach something you're not sure is stable. I talked to Mom, he said. After your letter. I asked her about the custody stuff. He paused. She didn't say you were lying. That's something. She said she did what she thought was right at the time. He turned his coffee cup in his hand. I don't know if I believe that completely, but I also don't want to spend the rest of my life being angry at her for something that happened when I was 6. That's a wise way to look at it. She's still my mom. She is. And she loves you. I never doubted that part. He looked up at me. Did she keep you from me on purpose? I thought about how to answer that honestly without making it worse. I think, I said slowly, that she was scared. And when people are scared, they protect themselves in ways that aren't always fair to other people. I don't think she set out to erase me. I think she just needed a story she could live inside. And the story she needed didn't have room for a complicated version of who I actually was. He nodded slowly. Gordon doesn't know any of this, does he? About your company and the campus? No. Are you going to tell him? Only if you want me to. Connor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I want to be the one to tell him, when I'm ready. He looked at me steadily. But I think he should know. I think everybody's been working with the wrong information for too long. Lee put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers. I watched my son sit there. This person I had made and then lost and was now, improbably, sitting across a diner table from. And I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something more solid than hope. More like recognition. Like finding a structural load-bearing wall you'd assumed had been demolished. Still standing, still sound, still capable of holding weight. 4 months after that lunch, Connor took me up on something I'd mentioned in passing. A project we were consulting on in Chicago, near where he was starting his new job. He asked if he could shadow the team for a day, just to see how the process worked on the consulting side. I said yes immediately and then spent 3 days trying not to make a bigger deal of it than it was. He showed up in a hard hat and steel-toed boots, took notes, asked the right questions, and at the end of the day stood with me on a pedestrian overpass we were reviewing and said, "You know what I love about bridges?" I said I didn't. He said, "They trust each other. The two sides don't know each other, but they hold the same weight and meet in the middle." I don't know if he meant it the way I heard it. I didn't ask. Some things are better left to stand on their own. 6 months later, Connor called me on a Sunday morning. The kind of call that starts before the other person has fully figured out what they want to say. He was quiet for a second after I picked up, and then he said, "So, Gordon knows." He told him over dinner the weekend before, not everything, not all the details of the campus infrastructure, but the broad fact of it, that my company had done the structural work on the lab, on the bridge, on the dormitory, that the consulting fees my firm had billed to Hartfield over the years were multiples of the donation Gordon had made. "How'd he take it?" I asked. "Better than I expected," Connor said. He was quiet for a long time. And then he said, "Well, I guess your father built the foundation and I just put up some curtains." A pause. I think it hurt him. But he said it anyway. I didn't know Gordon well enough to know whether that took courage or just honesty. But either way, it struck me as the right thing to say. "And your mom?" she cried. Said she was sorry. "I'm still working through that part." He exhaled. "We're going to be okay, I think. It's just going to take some time." "That's all it takes," I said. "Time and showing up." Last Thanksgiving was the first one we spent together in over 20 years. Connor and Lee came to my house, a place he'd never been before, and we cooked badly and laughed at ourselves about it, and watched football, and talked about a structural project in Cincinnati that I was bidding on, and Connor got out a napkin at one point and started sketching load calculations, and I looked at this man sitting at my kitchen table, my son, an engineer, someone who thinks about whether things will hold, and I understood something I hadn't before. The things I built weren't compensation for the years I'd missed. They weren't proof of worth or substitutes for presence. They were just what I knew how to do when I didn't know what else to do. And in some accidental, improbable way, they had been part of my son's life all along, holding weight quietly, the way a foundation does, without credit or ceremony. He didn't know I was there. And then he did. And now we're building something new on top of all of it. And that's enough, more than enough, for me. I think about Connor standing on that overpass in Chicago, talking about bridges trusting each other. He didn't know he was describing what it took us 20 years to figure out. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't wait for you to be ready for it. It just sits there, load-bearing, until someone finally looks up and notices it's been holding the weight all along. What I got wrong when Connor was small wasn't that I worked too hard. It was that I confused building something with being somewhere. I told myself the business was for him, for us, for the future. And maybe it was, eventually. But a 6-year-old can't live inside a future. He lives inside Tuesday afternoon, inside the drive home from school, inside whoever is sitting at the kitchen table when he gets there. I wasn't sitting at that table enough. That's just the truth of it, and no amount of successful consulting contracts changes what that cost him in those early years. The hard thing about being honest with yourself, really honest, not the version you rehearse for other people, is that it doesn't feel like relief at first. It feels like inventory. You go through everything and you look at what's there and what isn't, and you have to hold both without flinching. I had to look at the years I'd lost and not dress them up as someone else's fault entirely. Barbara made choices that weren't fair. Gordon stepped into a role I should have filled, but I had also given the system every reason to sideline me, and pretending otherwise would have been a story, not a reckoning. What got me through, what I think gets anyone through the long kind of loss, the kind that doesn't resolve in a season, is something closer to stubbornness than hope. I kept building, not to prove anything, not to manufacture some cosmic irony where my success would eventually embarrass the people who'd underestimated me. I just kept doing the work because the work was something I could control when everything else felt like it was happening to me. That stubbornness, that refusal to stop moving forward even when forward didn't seem to lead anywhere near my son. I think that's what kept me intact enough to be someone worth knowing when he finally came looking. And he did come looking. That still gets me when I think about it too directly. He read that letter 4 times. He drove 40 minutes to have lunch with me. He showed up in steel-toed boots wanting to understand what I'd built. Whatever else went wrong in those years, I hadn't become someone unrecognizable. Some version of his father had stayed in the work, in the care, in the quiet consistency of just not disappearing entirely. And he found it. I don't know if I'll ever fully make up for what he didn't have when he was young. I've stopped trying to calculate that. What I know is that the man sitting across from me at Thanksgiving, sketching load calculations on a napkin, laughing at my cooking, that man chose to be there. Nobody told him to. Nobody arranged it. He decided, with full adult understanding of the history, that I was worth knowing. That's not something I take lightly. It's also not something I earned through a single dramatic gesture. It came from years of showing up badly, then better, then honestly. From a letter I almost didn't send. From answering a call from a number I didn't recognize. Character isn't what you do when things are going well. It's what you keep doing when there's no audience and no guarantee it will ever matter. I kept doing it. And somehow, eventually, it mattered.